I live in Charleston around some back roads. So it's for the most part just woods and very few neighbors. We, Mom, Dad, and me, live somewhat into the woods with only 2 neighbor houses, one very friendly neighbor who has lived there since we moved here. And then there's this very old spooky haunted-looking house which sits directly in front of our mobile home. Nobody lived in that house for 2 years. One day I see a U-Haul truck sitting in the front yard, and so I assume somebody is finally moving in. I had somewhere to go, so I passed the U-Haul truck and see an old man with his dirty hoodie on. I rolled my window down to say hi. But as soon as he turned and saw me, he kinda ducked. I didn't say anything, just left. I thought it was kinda weird and secretly hoped he wasn't going to be our actual neighbor. After a day or 2, he brought his truck, and it was confirmed by our landlord that he was our new neighbor. For the first 2 weeks, every single night, and only at night, I would hear construction going on. It was a loud banging noise that would go on from around 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. The house was old, and so we thought he was tearing down some carpet or something. Well, after about 2 months of this constant noise, he was not letting us sleep. He would wake up everybody with this loud noise. So one day my dad decides he wants to know what's all the noise about, so very early in the morning he walks over, and just as he is about to get to the door, the neighbor was making that noise, and you won't believe what he saw. He said he saw him standing in his front door that faces our house, just opening and slamming it shut. I was in disbelief. Disgusted. Until I witnessed it. All this time he was just opening and slamming his door. We confronted him, and he seemed a little crazy. He said he wasn't making no noise and that it was us making noise. Anyways, the noise continued for a long time. We called the cops, and when they got there, he wouldn't answer, and they said they couldn't do anything because no laws were being broken. Landlord didn't care either. Would you believe me if I told you we stayed living in that house continually hearing him slamming doors all night? For a total of 3 years. I don't know who was crazier, us for staying and putting up with this obviously mentally ill guy with serious OCD, or something who was abandoned by his family there, or him. We guess because who else was paying the bills? We finally moved out last year. I still can't hear repeated noises like a hammer to a nail or similar noises. It brings me to disgust and near puking. I feel traumatized. Please don't just drop off your mentally ill family member. They need to be taken care of by professionals. I witnessed him slamming doors for 3 years, and even if it was snowing freezing cold, he would be outside slamming his truck door, any door, he would just slam it repeatedly. Years of interrupted sleep. And since we couldn't afford to move out, we had to just take it. It all happened during my junior year of college almost 30 years ago. 4 other girls and myself were living off campus in a house we rented together. It started in the fall with phone calls where the caller would just hang up, but gradually progressed to heavy breathing and moaning. In the beginning we ignored it, and then nervously laughed it off, but then the nature of the calls changed. The person calling, a male voice, would specifically ask for my roommate, or myself by our first name. He'd breathe heavily and moan and then hang up. When it reached this point we called the police and phone company to see if the call could be traced. The police came to talk to us but basically said that while the calls were disturbing, they weren't threatening and therefore couldn't really do anything. The phone company wouldn't do anything either. I think it being a college town they felt there were bigger issues for them to deal with. The calls kept coming, but now the person would comment about what my roommate or I were wearing or how our hair looked. My roommate and I each had jobs at our college's student union at the front desk. We thought maybe the caller was a fellow student or college worker who saw us, and that was why he knew what we were wearing or how our hair looked. We called the police again, and this time they took it a little more seriously, but still no phone trace. The phone company agreed to change our number to unlisted, but to get the number changed it would be an additional charge. We were college students strapped for cash, so changing the number wasn't an option. At the same time all this was happening, occasionally one of us would come home and find the front door unlocked. As there were 5 of us living in the house, we just thought that one of us went out and forgot to lock it. Then one weekend night I was home alone. My roommates had gone out for the evening and I stayed in because I wasn't feeling well. The phone rang and it was the caller again. This time he mentioned that he knew I was alone and maybe I wanted company. He told me not to worry because he knew how to let himself in the house. As he talked, he even commented about what was on the television in my house at the time. I immediately called my boyfriend and several other friends and begged them to come over right away. I also called the police and they said they would send a car. My boyfriend got there first, and while he was there the person called again. My boyfriend answered the phone and the caller just laughed at him and told him he couldn't protect me forever. My boyfriend had closed all the shades and curtains and the caller made a comment about it to him. It was then that we knew whoever was calling had to be a neighbor and had been watching our house. The police finally showed up and we shared what happened. This time they took it more seriously. They went to the houses around that had lights on and rang the doorbells and talked to a few people. They said they'd send extra patrols to go monitor our street the next few days. My boyfriend was in a fraternity and for the next week or so he or some of his frat brothers spent the night sleeping in our living room to help us feel safe. Our landlord came and switched out the locks to the front and back doors. As far as we knew, the police didn't get a tap for our phone, but we never heard from the caller again. My roommates and myself were cautious for the rest of the year. We made sure our blinds or curtains were shut all the time once it got dark and always checked to make sure the door was locked. None of us wanted to be alone in the house, especially after dark. It also changed how we viewed our neighbors. While we didn't know everyone around our house, we had met quite a few of them. My roommates and myself felt we couldn't trust the people around us and were afraid to interact with them. The year did end with something unnerving though. My roommate and I each received a note with the same message at work. The notes were dropped off during the last week of school before we went home for the summer. Each note simply said, "I'll miss you." We never did find out who made the calls or sent us the notes, but my roommate and myself were pretty sure it was a neighbor. I spent about 6 months living alone in a farmhouse while the owner went traveling with his family. It was a small dairy farm in north-central Pennsylvania, small enough that the family of 6 worked it alone with a few part-time hands when needed. The farm was at the center of about 50 acres. They grew their own feed and had some livestock that they used to feed themselves and sell off to a local butcher when needed. The owner was a friend and I was between jobs, so it was nice to just relax for 6 months rent-free and finish the great American novel inside this big, quaint farmhouse with a massive bathtub/jacuzzi, ballroom studio, and a walk-in freezer of food, like an Andrew Wyeth version of the Overlook Hotel. My first encounter with the neighbor who lived 2 miles up the road was when a woman knocked on the door. She was a well-worn 20-something in a shiny pencil skirt and corset with big heels that made it damn near impossible to walk in the wet yard. At the far end of the walkway to the gate, which she left open, was a white Lexus piloted by a well-tanned beef face with dark shades and a mouth that looked like the seam between 2 heavy pieces of brown marble. He looked like the star of an Indian version of the Terminator, at least from his no-neck up. The haggard blonde wobbling on the porch introduced her intentions as though her outfit and vocation were obvious. "The guy up the road paid me to come here and fuck you. You down?" As this was the first conversation I'd had with a real person in 2 days, I admit I stammered a bit in reply. Plus, the way she slurred through her words, I thought she asked if I was Don. "No, I'm Rudy." She just stared for a few seconds as if I would continue telling her about myself and then said, "I don't give a shit. Guy up the road paid me to fuck you, so where you wanna do this?" She seemed irritated that I was delaying the transaction for a lack of understanding. The man in the car, who I decided was not her boyfriend resisting her demands to ask for fucking directions out of Mayberry RFD, shifted a little in his seat and stared at me. My reaction was to assume this was an attempt to get in the house to rob it, and me. My experiences have taught me that this was a perfect distraction to occupy me while someone else slipped in the back or was going into the barn out back. So I smiled politely and said something like, "Nope. Not interested. Thanks though." I shut the door and went into sentry mode. I walked the main floor to make sure it was secure, scanned the open yard behind the house and back to the main staircase by the front door, pausing to see that the Lexus was still idling at the curb, the gate was still open, and the woman was yelling something like, "The fucker didn't want it. What do you want to do?" I didn't know if she was talking to the driver or if she had one of them newfangled cellular phones and was asking the neighbor up the road. While they worked things out, I went upstairs to get a better view of the grounds. I snatched up the cordless phone in the main hallway and carried it into each room as I made sure nobody else was trespassing. The yard and farm were clear. Someone started pounding on the front door. Given the meaty thumps, I decided it was the pimpinator coming up with the hard sell for prepaid hooker services. I ignored this until his fifth attempt shook the heavy wooden door in its frame. The house was large enough that it used an intercom system that linked it to all the different rooms, the barn, and the other small buildings on the property. From the kitchen, I activated the comm to the front porch with one hand and prepared to call 911 with the other. "Hey, if you're going to punch my door like that, it doesn't make me think you're a nice person I want inside my house." A moment later, Beef Tits figured out the comm and replied, "Come on, man. If you don't do this, she don't get paid." "She gonna get paid, bro." He punctuated this statement with another round of door percussion that lasted almost a full minute. I replied, "Not my problem. Get gone or go to jail. Stop fucking with the door, bro. One or both of them slammed the screen door so hard, I knew there had to be damage. I looked out into the yard again from the big bay window and saw someone on a small tractor something the size of a riding mower heading for one of the chicken coos. This was not a farmer, just some clown in jeans and a polo shirt riding his garden hopper over the grass dragging a small trailer with a cage. So when the 911 operator answered, I described this scene and suggested someone was out to steal my chickens while a prostitute and her pimp were pounding on my front door demanding I let them in. This was a situation that made the operator think I was a drunken, merry prankster. However, she agreed to send a cruiser with the kind of lazy commitment that made me glad that Meat Biscuits decided to make an appearance in the window at the back of the house and scream loud enough that I could hear him. The 911 operator could hear him, and even the weirdo on his tractor could hear him a couple of football fields downrange. Pimp Britches noticed I was on the phone and shut up. His head dropped like his spiritual director called, "Cut!" and he walked out of view toward the front of the house. The 911 operator decided this was a legitimate threat and made sure I stay on the call while she sent the entire Mayberry PD my way. I switched to speaker so Pimp Biscuit could hear the dispatcher confirm Andy and Barney were en route, locked and loaded. The weirdo on the tractor casually turned his rig around and headed back where he came from as if on a joyride through the tall grass. I gave as good a description as I could before he disappeared into nearby trees. I guess the hooker was taking a nap in the back of the Lexus, but by the time the local pup arrived there was nothing left of the pair except the dust their car kicked up gunning it off the property. The police talked to the weirdo on the tractor who was the neighbor from up the road. He did have a small tractor with a cage, but there wasn't much they could do until the Lexus was spotted and stopped a little later. Once Pixie and the Beef rolled on my neighbor, the police charged him related to soliciting prostitution which, as a registered sex offender, put him in jail. The guy lived in a small shack at the end of the lane just beyond the farm's property line, and he was trying to score chickens. He couldn't pay with cash, so he was going to pay in meth, I understand, which he had in abundance, according to the cops. I told this story to the owner of the house when he called the following day. He didn't seem surprised about his neighbor, but the hooking angle left his gasping for air. I guess because the local puppet didn't want to risk getting things wrong and it turning out that I was an accomplice or fan of paid sex with strangers, they sent a car around 2 or 3 times every day after, even stopping in to check on me. I got to know the local police pretty well and they were nice guys. But I was an outsider, even though they knew the owner of the house as a good Christian man of strong character. It clearly wasn't a strong enough endorsement to leave me be.